Austin, hi.
Hey, how are you doing today?
I'm doing so good. How about you?
Oh man, it's a great day and great weekend and excited to be here. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Can you give the listeners just a little bit of background on you? Because I really want to dive in on scaling a company and culture.
Yeah.
So give us a little background for you.
Yeah. So always been around in startups, started my career first in corporate. So I got to see cross-functional collaboration with one of the largest employers in Wisconsin, direct supply. Then decided, hey, I'm ready for startups. I want to move out west. End up joining a company called Bolt, which at the time had about 100 employees. And over the span of about a year and a half, we raised just under $1 billion, grew from a team of 100 to just over 1,200. At the height, my marketing budget was like 150 million in a quarter. So definitely was spending a ton and learned a ton there. Then went over to ARC, which is a bank for startups. In a year and a half, grew it from no deposits, no customers, and no banking revenue to being the top three bank for startups. So Brex, Mercury, and ARC. Then launched our own startup after going from really big to a little bit smaller to even smaller, and have learned a ton since growing the business from 0 to 250K in recurring revenue, then burning it down and going back up to 100K, and now we're well on our way back up to 100K again. So learned a lot. Been one heck of a journey, and excited to share some of those insights today.
Yeah, for sure. That's why I just love your energy, Austin. And when we talk, you just have such a nice way of boiling it down to like what really matters. So I think listeners will appreciate that about you. So why don't we start? Startup world can often be super fast paced, stress inducing. It can bring some like real tumultuousness. Is that a word? Tumultuousness?
I think so. Yeah.
Tumultuousness? Let's go with that. Anyway, it can be very tumultuous. That's what I was looking for. So, how do you deal with the pace?
Yeah. Well, so I think there's a few things. And that's a question that's near and dear to my heart because I think a lot of the times people talk about burnout, but until you've experienced it, you just don't know what it is. And like at the height, I think there's so much stress. And so you start to deprioritize all the things that made you great. And what I mean by that is like, I'm working 80 hours a week or 90 hours a week. And then it's like, okay, well, I guess I'm just going to not go to the gym because, like I get into the office at 7 and I leave at 9. Okay, well, probably not going to make it to the gym before or after that because I'm too tired. Then it's like, oh, well, I would make all my meals. Well, now you don't have time to make meals. So now you're ordering out, 4 or 5, 6 days a week. Then you're like, okay, well, maybe on the weekends I can go hang out with friends and I can do activities. And then you're like, well, shit, look at all this mountain of work that exists and it's never ending. And so you quickly start to take everything that defined your life and made your life great and slowly chip away at those things because the work just takes over. And in the beginning, it's like working that hard is like a rush. It's like a drug. It's like every single minute you spend building something, you think will return something in the back half. So you're living off of that high. But then it starts to compound, right? So you're not making food, you're not going to work out. And then slowly but surely, your life starts to dissolve. And what I mean by that is like the stress starts to build up, right? And it's just like stress on top of stress on top of stress. And so on the first go around with startups, I didn't have any balance. There was no balance. It didn't exist. Then the second go around in startups, I tried to have more balance in terms of like maintaining my lifestyle. And it wasn't until this third startup that now we finally have this balance of yes, it is a sprint, but it is also a marathon. And by that, I mean like you have to sprint and then you have to recover. And so I've purposefully made a priority to work out 4 or 5 times a week. I just got done running a marathon yesterday. I try to cook my own meals. I try not to, take work and put it into every aspect of my life. And I try to separate those two things. And just the mental clarity and like the ability to function at a high level continuously over time is just so much more sustainable than trying to sprint every single week.
Yeah, I think there's a stat out there that 60% of startups fail due to the well-being of the founders. And you could probably like, yeah, really, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's everything, right? So it's like your social health. So you're not going out with friends. It's your emotional health because basically everything falls on your shoulders. It's your physical health because you're not eating right. You're not going out and exercising. You're not doing these things. And so it's just like every single one of those aspects you start to put on the wayside and you can do it for a while, but eventually it compounds and then it becomes even harder to dig yourself out of that hole. And so I think making sure you set clear boundaries and making sure you prioritize those aspects of your life, you just perform so much better for so much longer than the alternative. And
Mhm.
so I would just encourage people to take a look at what things that they're doing in their life and what is the 1 hour a day that they can set aside to do the activities they need to do to actually continue to prosper their health.
Yeah. And Austin, do you think that's something that you would say do from the very beginning, or are there certain breakpoints in the scaling of a company that you're like, you got to work really hard here, and then maybe you can start to set boundaries here, or should it be all throughout?
It's funny because the people that I've met that claim that they have no time are the same people that end up doing the same mistakes over and over and over again, right? Because you you spend so much time and work so hard on all these things, and you think that you're moving the ball by N, but then you realize the next day, like all this code I wrote was shit, or oh, I realized this marketing campaign that I had was shit. And then you talk to these people who, they're some of the wealthiest, most powerful, most uh, highest contributors to society, meaning they've made these incredible businesses. And they all have the same story, which is they sprint really hard, but then they have the time to relax. Because some of their best ideas come when they're not working. It's when they're taking a walk, when they're reading a book, when they're cooking food with their family, when they're on a vacation. Like that's when your brain has time to relax. And that's when the ideas come to them. And so I think it needs to start from the beginning, but I think in the beginning, it's also like it is a sprint. It's not easy. It's working around the clock nonstop. But having a 30-minute break or having an hour break a day just helps you reset your framework for looking at problems, which means ultimately you have and can solve problems more efficiently. And so I think it needs to start from the beginning, but I think it is true that you do need to put forth a heck of a lot of effort to move the puck forward.
Yeah, sure. And when I talk to startup founders, Austin, I'm always saying like, look, they're that starts with you, but it goes down to your people. Like you've got to put those habits, excuse me, you've got to put those habits down to your people, or they're not going to survive. You're going to burn them out too quickly. So this isn't just about you, it's about them, right? And I think one of the things that always gets people jammed up when it comes to startups is like, how transparent should they be? How much of their own journey, how much of the startup journey, the financials to share? Like, what is your view on that transparency?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I struggle with it because I've been on both sides of the coin. And by that, I mean, like, I've been involved in conversations where something is going to happen, but you're not allowed to share it with the rest of your employees. Whether it was because I was at one of those other startups and, you have a lot of things that are in flight and moving, and it's like, well, who do you tell and who do you don't tell? And why, right? Because there is a real liability with sharing stuff that it gets out and then it's not finalized and then the contract falls through, or hey, it's not legal to share this and they can come back after you. Ultimately, I try to err on the side of what would I want to know and like what is going to help me do my best job. I think as an executive, it's sort of your role to shield the rest of your teammates from the things that could hurt them. And by that, I mean, like, there's a lot of minutia that goes along in business, right? Whether it's lawsuits or whether it's partnership contracts or whether it's funding announcements or like, there's a bunch of things that people should be aware of, but not until the table's already been set. Like, what's going to happen. And
Mm-hmm.
so to answer your question more directly, I try to be transparent as I can, and try to share as much as I can, as long as the net benefit is greater than the net potential harm that could happen. And so it's keeping everybody in line on like, here's how we're performing, here's the reality of that situation, here's what we shared with these people, so that you have the context of why, and here's what we shared with this group, and here's the context of why. So it's kind of like crafting that narrative or crafting that pitch depending on which audience you have and trying to get everybody aligned on the same page and why something is happening. Because I think a lot of people want to know why we made a decision. They don't necessarily care what the decision was made. They just want to know why you made the decision. And so bringing them up to speed with the context is super important.
Yeah. And I think giving them that so that they understand, yes, of course, why was the decision made, but how does it relate to me as an individual? How does it relate to my role? They need that context. But let's flip that, Austin, because I think as a company grows, I've seen context suffer for the leadership team, right? They get more disconnected from the employees as they move up and as the organization grows. At what point does context just suffer?
It's a good question. I would say that, there's a very big difference between good organizations and great organizations. And great organizations have found a way, regardless of how big they are, to have that context throughout the entire organization.
Mm.
And I think it starts with what kinds of culture you build in terms of like making sure everybody's aligned on the same page. And some things, to your point, don't matter. Like some things, it doesn't matter whether or not it's shared across the board because it's not relevant. But there are some things that are so core to the business that if people don't share the context or they don't have that context, they literally cannot do their job. And so I think a good example of that or a good business practice is Amazon's two pizza rule. It's like you don't need a working group that's greater than two pizzas because nothing, the end increase doesn't actually increase the output. And so, regardless of how big the organization was, we always tried to keep that in line. So, let's say you have a marketing campaign and you're going to go execute against it, and it's a funding announcement. Well, what are stakeholders you need? You need like one person from content, you need one person from email and lifecycle, you might need one person from demand gen, you might need one person from PR and comms. Then you have one person who oversees that whole thing, which is the integrated marketer, who their role is to essentially cross collaborate with all those people so that all the messaging and sound points are the same. So that's the individual that's involved in all the executive calls and all the diligence calls and all of the final stakeholder calls. This is involved in finance. And that person is the point person who essentially gathers all this information and makes sure that everybody's aligned on what they're going to do. And so when you have that person in place and that person becomes your coach, essentially they're guiding that playbook and they're the source of truth so that everybody knows who to turn to with questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't necessarily know that there's breakpoints where communication breaks down. It's just in what systems and ways you communicate. So maybe when you're early days, you're using Slack. Then maybe you have Notion. Then maybe you have weekly team updates. Then maybe you go to biweekly team updates. Then maybe you have once a month. You have milestones and product plans. And so it's just at what level you communicate and who are the stakeholders or who's that point person that can help communicate that across the organization.
Yeah, for sure. And if we go up and thinking about context for the leadership team, is there a certain size that the organization reaches where like the context suffers that they get from the organization?
Yes and no. I think it's not necessarily the size of the organization. I think it's how fast the organization is growing. If
Okay.
you're growing at 20 people per week, it's fairly easy to keep up and make sure that all those individuals are caught up to track. But when you go from like 20 people every couple of weeks to like 100 people in 2 weeks or 200 people in 2 weeks, or you go from like 300 people to 900 people in 6 months, you've now tripled the size of your organization. And that means triple the amount of people that have opinions and perspectives, and they don't have the 2+ years or 3 years of context that went into how they were today. And so it's not necessarily how big the organization is, it's how big you scale the organization and whether or not that communication that grows is asymmetrical or symmetric, right? Meaning you have 50 people that join. Okay, are those 50 people all now middle managers? Are those 50 people execs? Are those ICs? And then how fast are you onboarding those people? And who's actually responsible for making sure they're caught up to speed? Because there really is an onboarding ramp for new employees. And so it's not necessarily the executive team that struggles. It's actually the people that are below the executive team. Because at the end of the day, the executive team is still getting all the metrics. The executive team is still getting all the data they had before. The difference is now when you have 3 layers deep of people that all have opinions and perspectives on what data you should share and what data you're collecting and whatever else, now it starts to dilute what the executive team actually receives at the end. So I think that's the bigger question is like, how fast can you actually onboard people and make sure that everybody's brought up to speed in relation to how big the company is overall?
I think that's really wise advice as you start to pace your hiring. I think, well, in my opinion, love to hear what you think, Austin. I think if more startups or even larger companies would pay better attention to their workforce planning, we wouldn't have these large scale layoffs.
I think it's tough to say whether or not that's the case. I think people have expectations of how they're going to perform. And I think people plan for hiring lots of individuals to support an initiative without knowing whether or not the initiative is going to be successful. And I think you have an environment, especially in venture-backed startups, where you raise this Series A, Series B, Series C, Series D, doesn't make a difference. And now you have this expectation from investors on growth. Well, how do you grow? Well, you can spend more money on marketing, you can spend more money on sales, But typically what you do is you say, okay, well, we could just go hire some more salespeople who already have experience in the area and already have pipeline and already have built all these relationships and they'll drive revenue. Or you can say, hey, we're going to spin up this new product line. Now we need to hire customer success and we expect to drive 10,000 new customer signups. So now we need to hire 20 CS people. And you're like, well, hang on a second here now. Just because you expect to drive that much results, like let's see some shots on the board, let's see some successes first, then let's go hire them. But that inherently is different from the expectations that investors set, which is now I've given you $100 million. I want to see 20% growth every week or 20% growth every month. And so you have this misalignment of expectations, which forces you to make decisions on an accelerated timeline that might not necessarily align with a realistic outcome that you can expect to have happen from the input.
Yeah, agreed. I think too, you hit the nail on the head with Amazon's two pizza rule. Like we need smaller teams. I think we overbuild teams and it causes conflict. We're looking for consensus instead of collaboration. So I think smaller, more nimble teams is definitely a way to go too. Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on what the initiative is, though, right? Like sometimes you need that many people,
Mm-hmm.
but most cases you don't. And a good example of when you would need that many people is if you're going to roll out an entirely new product suite. You
Mm-hmm.
better make sure you have a solutions engineer, a product specialist, or a PM. You better make sure you have product marketing, you have the web team, you have the design team, you have the copy team. I mean, you better make sure you have all those people, plus the sales team, the CS team. Like everybody has to be aligned on what this thing is, what this thing does, what this thing means to our customers, and ultimately why we're launching it. And until you have cross functional collaboration and alignment on what that thing is, you're setting yourself up for failure, which so many times you'll see like, we're going to launch this product and we're only going to have sales and marketing. And then CS hears about it, it's live, and they're like, wait a minute, we don't have any training guys ready. Or the design team's like, wait a minute, you launched this thing, but who'd you use for design? And how does that fit into our overall design structure and framework? And so, like, just straight out of the gate, you get a lot of people that are like this rub, this friction of like, hey, you didn't loop me in, and so you start to create those misaligned relationships. And so I think that's a key piece of learning is just make sure if you're going to launch something that impacts the entire organization, you have everybody bought into what it is before you even decide to go to market with it.
Yeah. Change management, right? Build that awareness, create that desire, build the knowledge. Yeah, I'm with you. This is probably one of my favorite questions, Austin. But as you look back on your experiences, what would you do better or differently as you scaled?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of decisions we made that went really well and a lot of decisions that didn't go as planned. I think it's funny to look back at some of the decisions that didn't go as well because in the moment you thought, hey, this thing is going to be a high flying success. Like I have no questions in my mind that it's going to win. But then you start to get early indicators that it's not going to work. And instead of cutting the losses, you just keep investing in it. So you keep pouring more and more and more time into it. And then you have some things where they work really well and you decide, hey, I'm going to cut back. So it's that classic, like letting your winners run and cutting your losses fast. But I think so much of the time, especially in startups, you get tied to your idea and it's like it becomes part of your identity like, oh, this was my idea. And so like you don't want to admit you were wrong. And I think those were the times where we should have cut losses and we didn't. And ultimately we just kept pouring money into it. And so like it was one of those opportunity cost moments. And then there's other times where it worked really well and we identified it worked really well and we kept going. So a good example was at Bolt, we had this campaign where we were giving away these penny hoodies and we were giving hoodies away for a penny. And the whole point was people would create an account, be able to buy a hoodie for a penny, and then we'd create two things, we'd accomplish two things. We'd have a new account and we'd have their credit card details. So now anytime they shopped across any network or any Bolt Power retailer across the network, they'd have a one-click experience. And
Mm.
so we poured lots and lots of money into it and it was a success and we kept running it. Another example of something that didn't work as well is we had this COVID tracker on tracking what retailers were doing in response to the pandemic. And like the first week, no media coverage. Then the second week, no media coverage. Then the third week, no media coverage. And like we kept pouring resources and time and effort into this campaign that did absolutely nothing. And we thought it was going to do well and it didn't. And we should have just cut losses, but we ended up maintaining that thing for like 6 or 8 months, which meant our data team needs to pull more data, our PR team needs to keep pitching it, like all this stuff. And we just kept pitching it and it just didn't work. And so my point is like early, usually if you have a good idea and you start to see traction, like continue going down that path. But if you don't see any traction, there's no point in continuing because either nobody cares about it, it's not relevant, or it's just not going to work. And
Yeah.
so cut the losses early and let the winners ride.
Great counsel. Great counsel. What do you think, though? I mentioned hiring, and sometimes I think overhiring can happen. When, what's your advice for the pace of hiring for these organizations? Did you learn anything around that?
Honestly, I'm not an expert in hiring. All I have to say on that matter is make sure you're hiring the right people. I think so much of the time you hire somebody because they look really good on paper, meaning they might have gone to the right schools, maybe they worked at big tech, maybe they had every box that you could have possibly wanted to check, and on paper they looked like a great hire. And then you hire them and you realize this person's not actually going to be successful because they've never had to operate in an environment that doesn't have all the resources they need. Meaning, you hire somebody that came from big tech and they usually have a solutions engineer, they have their own dedicated PMM, they have their own dedicated PM, they have their own dedicated email team, they have their own. And so you look at like the context of like how big their team was and how many people supported them, and they want to do strategy work. Well, at an organization that's not Microsoft, you have to be able to operate in the trenches, or at an organization that's not, 600 people big marketing team. And so it's like you put people in an environment in which they can't succeed, and then you wonder like why didn't they succeed? Well, arguably that person wasn't set up from success from day one. And so it's not necessarily how many people you hire. I think it's the context in which you hired them, the environment in which they grew up and they have experience in, and then ultimately the environment in which they can be successful in. Because it's really easy to go from startups to big tech, but I would argue it's actually much more difficult to go from big tech to startups.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I can see it. I can see it. Last question for you, Austin, if you have one more minute.
Yeah, of
Okay.
course.
So let's flip that, right? I talked about what would you do better or differently. What do you think you did right?
It's a good question. I think we made a lot of decisions, and I'll go back to ARC for a second, which is one of the top three banks for startups. We had no brand, no customers, no real foothold in the market. And we took a look at like how the players got to where they were today, the biggest brands. And they got there through either spending tons of money on advertising and getting their name out there, so building brand, building an incredible product and not releasing the product for 6 or 8 years into the market, right? So you got 6 to 8 years of product development before they even launched. And so we said, okay, what are the ways in which we can compete? And so we looked at all the different marketing channels. We looked at all the sales channels. We looked at all of the different product positioning and pricing and placement, like all the 5 Ps you hear about in marketing class, right? It's like, here's all the different ways you can differentiate a product. And you're like, yeah, blah, 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 right? You're like, okay, maybe I'll use that someday. But truly, we looked at every single way we could differentiate the product. And then we looked at all the channels we could distribute the product. And we built ourselves a really nice niche. We were going after field and events. So we were doing events where we knew we could bring founders in person. So think happy hours, think dinners, think fun events like playing pickleball or basketball or whatever. Content, because nobody had created a content engine to educate founders on what are the things you need to know about fundraising, what are the different terms you need to know, what are the things you should watch out for when you're running a process, and then social, right? How do we create content, distribute it on social, and then essentially get free views? And so we went from having no social presence to having 10,000 followers, averaging a few million impressions a month, having events multiple times per week, and bringing in lots and lots of founders in return positive ROI on all of that spend. And then ultimately creating this content that ranked number one on Google because nobody had decided they wanted to write about it. What's treasury management? How do you structure T-bills? How do you determine liquidity versus yield? And so we built this sort of niche around these three content pillars. And then we built a product that fit this unique need in the market, which is how do you ladder T-bills? How do you buy direct T-bills? How do you do all of these structured finance products that nobody else had thought founders cared about or wanted? And so we did that. And in a year and a half, we became one of the top three banks for startups. So it wasn't like decisions that I had made. It was decisions that everybody at the organization had made and turned out to be the right decisions. And could have not worked that way, but it did. It worked really well. And so my point is we made some good decisions. We made some bad decisions. But ultimately the decisions that went right went really right. And ultimately that set us up for success.
Yeah. So I heard Austin going in on education, right? Making sure you're educating and sort of creating hype around the education and going all in on content, events, and social.
That's right. Yeah. So that's what we did. And then we hosted one of the largest events for startups ever, hosted by another startup. We took over Giant Stadium. We had 800 plus founders at the event. And then it wasn't just like that event ended and people were like done. It was like it created hype and buzz and people were talking about it. And you saw it everywhere on social and people were posting pictures of themselves and the players and the ARC branding and just like it created this like wave that you never thought you'd have an impact simply by saying, "Hey, what's something that's new, unique, nobody's ever seen before?" You put the wave out there, and then the wave just started carrying and continuing throughout ripples.
Yeah. Ripples, love it. Austin, thanks for your wisdom. Thanks for sharing stories with us today. It was fun to jam.
Thanks, Anna.